The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of the Harrington estate, each drop echoing through the vast corridors like whispers of forgotten sins. Sophia Harrington stood in the doorway of the private library, her black dress still damp from the funeral, her eyes red but no longer producing tears. She had cried enough. Now she just felt hollow. Her grandfather, Edward Harrington, the man who had taught her to read in this very room, who had placed her on his knee and told her stories of building empires, was gone. The funeral had been a spectacle, as expected. Hundreds of people, politicians, business moguls, celebrities, all offering their carefully rehearsed condolences. But none of them knew him, not really. At least that's what Sophia had always believed. She stepped into the library, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The smell of old leather and aged paper wrapped around her like a familiar embrace. This room had always been her sanctuary, the one place in the massive estate where she felt she could breathe. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, filled with first editions, rare manuscripts and books in languages she couldn't read. Her grandfather had collected them obsessively, spending millions on auctions, sometimes buying entire collections just to obtain a single volume. He used to say that knowledge was the only currency that never devalued. Sophia walked slowly between the shelves, running her fingers along the spines, remembering afternoons spent here. The old man's voice reading aloud, his glasses perched on his nose, his face animated with passion for whatever story he was sharing. But tonight something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with something she couldn't name. Maybe it was grief playing tricks on her mind. Or maybe it was the weight of knowing she was now the primary heir to a fortune worth billions. A fortune she had never wanted, a responsibility she had spent her entire adult life trying to avoid. Sophia had become a criminal defense attorney specifically to distance herself from the family business, to prove she could succeed on her own terms without the Harrington name opening doors for her. Yet here she was, standing in the heart of the empire, unable to escape the gravity of her bloodline. She poured herself a glass of scotch from the crystal decanter on her grandfather's desk. The same desk where he had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions, where he had made decisions that shaped industries and destroyed competitors. The liquid burned going down, but she welcomed the sensation. Anything to feel something other than this numbness. As she turned to leave, her elbow caught the edge of a leather-bound volume jutting slightly from the shelf. The book fell, hitting the floor with a heavy thud that seemed too loud in the silence. Sophia bent to pick it up, noticing it was a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, one her grandfather had read to her countless times. But as she reached for it, she noticed something odd. The book had fallen at an angle that revealed a small gap behind the shelf, and through that gap, she could see darkness, a space where there shouldn't be one. Her heart began to beat faster. She set down her glass and examined the shelf more carefully. Running her hands along the wood, she found a small brass mechanism hidden in the decorative molding, so subtle it would be invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. With trembling fingers, she pressed it. There was a soft click, followed by a mechanical whir, and the entire section of shelving swung inward, revealing a narrow doorway and a set of stairs descending into darkness. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She had lived in this house for 28 years, had spent countless hours in this library, and she had never known this existed. For a long moment she just stood there, staring into the darkness, her mind racing. Every instinct told her to close the door, to walk away, to leave whatever secrets her grandfather had hidden in the shadows where they belonged. But she couldn't. The attorney in her, the part of her trained to seek truth and evidence, wouldn't allow it. She grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped through the doorway. The stairs were steep and narrow, the walls close enough to touch on both sides. As she descended, the air grew colder, and she could smell something musty, like old paper and chemicals. At the bottom, she found herself in a small room, maybe 15 feet square, with no windows and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. She found the switch and flipped it, and harsh white light flooded the space. What she saw made her stomach turn. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, dozens of them, all meticulously labeled with dates and names. A desk sat in the center of the room, and on it were stacks of folders, each marked with red stamps reading confidential. But it was the wall opposite the stairs that truly captured her attention. It was covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and documents, all connected by red string in a web of connections that looked like something from a detective's investigation board. Sophia approached slowly, her legs feeling weak. The photographs showed people, dozens of different faces, and beneath each one were handwritten notes. Disappeared, read one. Accident, read another. Suicide, said a third. But the word that appeared most often, written in her grandfather's distinctive handwriting, was neutralized. She pulled a folder from the nearest filing cabinet at random. Inside were contracts, legal documents for a real estate development in downtown Chicago from 1992. But as she read through them, she realized the signatures were forged, the permits were fraudulent, and there were photographs of the buildings that had previously occupied the land. Tenement buildings filled with low-income families. Clipped to the photos was a newspaper article about a mysterious fire that had killed 17 people and displaced hundreds more. Beneath it, a memo in her grandfather's handwriting. Problem resolved. Proceed with development. Insurance will cover any complications. Make sure the fire inspector receives his payment. Sophia's hands shook as she set the folder down and reached for another. This one was thicker, dated 2003. Inside were medical records, dozens of them, all for workers at a Harrington manufacturing plant in Ohio. The records documented cases of cancer, respiratory disease, and neurological disorders. There were internal memos discussing the presence of toxic chemicals in the facility, recommendations for safety upgrades that would cost the company millions, and then her grandfather's response. Typed and signed, recommendations denied, costs prohibitive, increase insurance coverage for workers instead, and include mandatory arbitration clauses in all new contracts. Ensure no admissions of knowledge or liability. Beneath these documents were death certificates, at least 30 of them, all workers from that same plant, all dead before the age of 60. She felt bile rising in her throat, but forced herself to keep looking. Another folder contained evidence of witness tampering in a lawsuit against Harrington Industries. There were photographs of the key witness, a woman named Maria Santos, along with transcripts of her original testimony, describing safety violations that had led to her husband's death in a workplace accident. But there was also a contract signed by Maria, agreeing to change her testimony in exchange for $500,000 and relocation assistance. Clipped to it was a note. If she reconsiders, implement contingency Plan B. There was no explanation of what Plan B entailed, but there was a newspaper clipping from 6 months later. Maria Santos had died in a car accident on a rural highway. The police report concluded she had fallen asleep at the wheel, but someone had highlighted a sentence. No skid marks found at scene. Sophia backed away from the cabinet, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be her grandfather, the man who had attended her school plays, who had taught her to play chess, who had donated millions to hospitals and universities. But the evidence was right in front of her, irrefutable and damning. She forced herself to keep looking, to understand the full scope of what she had discovered. There were files on bribed politicians, with ledgers showing payments made through shell corporations. There were recordings, actual cassette tapes labeled with names and dates. She found a tape player on the desk and, with shaking hands, inserted one of the tapes. Her grandfather's voice filled the room, younger than she remembered, but unmistakable. He was speaking with someone, discussing how to handle a journalist who was investigating Harrington Industries' environmental practices. The conversation was casual, almost friendly, as they discussed various options, discrediting the journalist, buying the newspaper, or, if necessary, arranging an accident. They settled on buying the newspaper and firing the journalist, which they agreed was cleaner. Her grandfather laughed, actually laughed, and said something that made Sophia's blood run cold. We can always revisit the other option if he continues to be a problem elsewhere. She ejected the tape and grabbed another folder, this one more recent, dated just 5 years ago. It contained documents related to a hostile takeover of a competitor, but these weren't normal business dealings. There were surveillance reports, photographs of the CEO with a woman who wasn't his wife, recordings of private conversations, and a detailed plan to use this information to force him to sell his company at a fraction of its value. The plan had worked. Sophia remembered reading about this acquisition in the business press, how her grandfather had been praised for his shrewd negotiating. What the press hadn't known was that the CEO had committed suicide 3 months after the sale, unable to cope with the public scandal that had erupted when his affair was mysteriously leaked to the media. In the folder was a final note from her grandfather. Acceptable outcome. Removes any possibility of future complications or revenge attempts. Sophia sank into the chair at the desk, her legs no longer able to support her. She looked around the room, at the filing cabinets that likely contained hundreds more stories like these. Decades of crimes dressed up as business decisions, murders disguised as accidents, lives destroyed and then filed away in neat folders. How many people had suffered so that she could grow up in a mansion, attend the best schools, wear designer clothes, and live without ever worrying about money? How many families had been torn apart so that the Harrington name could be synonymous with success and power? But beneath the horror, another emotion was beginning to emerge. Anger. Her grandfather had lied to her, to everyone. He had presented himself as a self-made man, a philanthropist, a pillar of the community, when in reality he was a criminal who had simply been wealthy enough and powerful enough to avoid consequences. Every lesson he had taught her, every value he had claimed to hold, was a lie. And he had done all of this knowing that someday she would inherit his empire, that she would carry on his legacy, never knowing it was built on bones and blood. She stood up, her jaw set with determination. She was an attorney. She knew what this evidence meant. These files could bring down not just her grandfather's reputation, but the entire Harrington business empire. There would be lawsuits, criminal investigations, prosecutions. The family name would be destroyed. The fortune would be seized or paid out in settlements and judgments. Her mother, her uncles, her cousins, everyone who had benefited from this empire would lose everything. And she would be the one responsible, the whistleblower who had torn apart her own family. But as she looked at the faces on the wall, at the documents detailing so much pain and suffering, she knew she couldn't just walk away. These victims deserved justice, even if it came decades too late. Their families deserved to know the truth. But then she heard it, a sound that made her freeze. Footsteps coming from the library above. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving toward the hidden door. Sophia's heart hammered in her chest. She quickly turned off the light and pressed herself against the wall beside the stairs, her phone clutched in her hand. The footsteps stopped and she heard the mechanism click. The door swung open, and light from the library flooded down the stairs. A shadow appeared, long and distorted, and then a figure began to descend. Sophia held her breath, her mind racing. Who else knew about this room? As the figure reached the bottom of the stairs and flipped on the light, Sophia found herself face to face with her uncle, Thomas Harrington, her grandfather's youngest son. Thomas froze when he saw her, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and then something darker, something calculating. He was still wearing his funeral suit, but his tie was loosened, and there were bags under his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with accusation and fear. Finally, Thomas let out a long breath and ran a hand through his graying hair. "So you found it?" he said quietly, his voice carrying a weariness that made him sound decades older. "I was hoping you wouldn't, that we could just seal this room up and pretend it never existed. But I suppose that was naive." Sophia stepped away from the wall, her body tense, ready to run if necessary. "You knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but loaded with betrayal. "You knew what he did, what he was, and you said nothing. You stood at that funeral and praised him, called him a great man, a loving father, and you knew." Thomas walked past her to the desk, his movements slow and heavy, like a man carrying an unbearable weight. He picked up one of the folders, glanced at it without really seeing it, and set it back down. "I found this room when I was 25, he said, not looking at her. "I had just joined the company, was being groomed to take over a division, and I thought I deserved access to all of Father's files, all his business secrets. I searched this library for hours before I found the mechanism, and when I came down here and saw what was inside, it destroyed me. Everything I believed about my father, about my family, about myself, it all crumbled." He finally turned to look at her, and Sophia was shocked to see tears in his eyes. "I told myself I would expose him, that I would take all of this to the authorities and do the right thing. I spent weeks agonizing over it, barely sleeping, barely eating. But then Father called me into his office. He knew I had found the room, had probably been watching me, waiting to see what I would do. And he sat me down and explained how the world really works, Sophia. He told me that everything in those files, every terrible thing he had done to protect the family, to ensure that we would never want for anything, that we would have power and influence and security. He told me that if I exposed him, I wouldn't just be destroying him. I would be destroying my mother, my brothers, their children, everyone who depended on the Harrington name and fortune. Thomas sat down heavily in the chair, his shoulders slumped, and then he asked me a question that I've never been able to answer. He asked me if the lives of strangers, people I would never meet, people who were already gone, were worth more than the lives of my own family. He asked me if I was willing to condemn my mother to poverty and shame, to take away my nieces' and nephews' futures, to destroy everything our family had built over 3 generations. And I couldn't say yes, Sophia. I tried, I wanted to, but I couldn't. So I made a choice, and I've lived with that choice for 27 years, and it has eaten me alive every single day. Sophia felt her anger warring with something that might have been sympathy, but she pushed it away. That's not a justification, Uncle Thomas. Those people in these files, they had families too. They had futures that were stolen from them. You chose comfort over justice. You chose money over morality. And you've let your father's crimes continue to benefit you for nearly 3 decades. How many of these files are from after you discovered this room? How many more victims were there because you stayed silent? Thomas looked up at her, his face crumbling. I tried to stop him, Sophia. I swear I did. I argued with him constantly, tried to steer the company toward legitimate practices, pushed for safety improvements and ethical standards. But he always found ways around me, always had someone else who would do what needed to be done if I wouldn't. And the files from after I found this room, there are fewer of them, less severe. I like to think I made some difference, that I saved some people, even if I couldn't save them all. He laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of humor. But that's just something I tell myself so I can sleep at night, isn't it? The truth is, I'm complicit. I've been complicit for 27 years, and nothing I do can change that. Sophia walked to the wall covered in photographs and documents, studying the faces again. I'm taking all of this to the authorities, she said firmly, though her voice shook slightly. I'm going to expose everything. Let the families of these victims know the truth, and let the law handle the consequences. The Harrington Empire is built on suffering, and it needs to end. She heard Thomas stand up behind her, and every muscle in her body tensed, suddenly aware of how isolated they were. How far underground, how no one knew she was here. Her uncle had kept his father's secrets for 27 years, had chosen family over justice once before. What would he do to protect those secrets now? She turned slowly, ready to defend herself, but what she saw stopped her cold. Thomas wasn't approaching her threateningly. He was standing by the desk, and he had pulled out a gun from one of the drawers, a sleek black pistol that looked incongruous in his shaking hands. I can't let you do that, Sophia, he said, and his voice was breaking, tears streaming down his face openly now. I've sacrificed too much, carried this burden for too long to have it all be for nothing. If you expose this, everything I've done, every compromise I've made with my conscience, it all becomes meaningless. The family will be destroyed, and I'll have spent 27 years protecting monsters for nothing. Sophia's heart was racing, but she forced herself to stay calm, to use the skills she had developed in courtrooms and negotiations. Uncle Thomas, you don't want to do this, she said softly, keeping her voice steady. You just told me how much this has tortured you, how it's eaten you alive. Adding my murder to the list of Harrington crimes isn't going to make that better. It's only going to make it worse. And you won't be able to hide it. People know I came here tonight. My phone has a location tracker. There will be an investigation. Thomas laughed again, that same broken sound. You think I'm going to kill you? God, Sophia, is that what you think of me? That I'm so far gone that I would murder my own niece? He looked down at the gun in his hands as if seeing it for the first time, and then he turned it around, pressing the barrel against his own temple. This isn't for you, sweetheart. This is for me. Because I can't do it anymore. I can't carry this weight for another day. I thought maybe when Father died I would feel free, that the burden would lift, but it's only gotten heavier. And if you're going to expose everything anyway, if the truth is finally going to come out, then I don't want to be here to see it. I don't want to face those families, to see the hatred in their eyes when they realize I knew and did nothing. I'd rather die believing that I did what I had to do to protect the people I loved than live knowing that I was just a coward who valued his comfort over other people's lives. No. Sophia lunged forward, crossing the distance between them in 2 quick steps. She grabbed for the gun, but Thomas was stronger, and he pushed her back. She stumbled but caught herself on the desk. "Uncle Thomas, please don't do this. You said it yourself. You tried to make things better. You did make some difference. And if you want to make a real difference now, help me. Help me expose this. Help me make sure these families get justice. Help me dismantle the system that allowed this to happen. That's how you make your 27 years of suffering mean something, not by ending your life." Thomas kept the gun against his head, but his hand was shaking violently. "And then what, Sophia? I go to prison? I lose everything? I become the villain in some news story about corporate corruption? I watch my children and grandchildren suffer for my sins?" Sophia took a careful step closer, her hands raised in a peaceful gesture. Maybe all of those things happen, but you also get to tell the truth finally after 27 years of lies. You get to help these families find closure. You get to stop being the man your father made you and start being the man you wanted to be when you first found this room. And you don't have to do it alone. I'll be right there with you. We'll face it together. For a long moment, Thomas just stood there, the gun trembling against his skin, his face twisted with anguish. Then slowly his hand lowered. The gun dropped to his side, and he collapsed back into the chair, sobbing openly now. Great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. Sophia quickly took the gun from his loose grip and set it on top of one of the filing cabinets, far out of reach. Then she knelt beside her uncle and put her arms around him, holding him as he cried, as 27 years of guilt and shame and self-hatred poured out of him. "I'm sorry," he kept saying over and over. "I'm so sorry. I should have been stronger. I should have done the right thing from the beginning. I'm sorry." They stayed like that for several minutes until Thomas's sobs finally subsided into quiet weeping. When he could speak again, his voice was hoarse. "There's something you need to know," he said. "I'm not the only one who knows about this room. Your mother knows too, and your cousin, Richard. We've all been down here, we've all seen the files, and we all made the same choice I did. We chose family over justice. And when you try to expose this, they're going to fight you, Sophia. They're going to hire the best lawyers. They're going to discredit you. They're going to do everything in their power to protect the family name. This isn't going to be easy." Sophia stood up, her jaw set with determination. "I didn't expect it to be easy, Uncle Thomas, but it's necessary. And if they want to fight me, then I'll fight back. I have evidence, I have documentation, and now I have you as a witness, assuming you're willing to testify." Thomas looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen, but there was something new in them, something that might have been hope. "If I do this, if I help you, there's no going back. I'll lose everything, my family will hate me, I'll probably go to prison. You understand that, right? You're asking me to sacrifice everything." Sophia met his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking you to do anything, Uncle Thomas. I'm giving you a choice. The same choice you had 27 years ago, except this time you already know what it costs to make the wrong decision. You can help me bring justice to these families, or you can try to stop me and live with even more blood on your hands. But either way, I'm moving forward with this. The truth is coming out, and the Harrington Empire is going to fall. The only question is whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him struggling, weighing decades of loyalty and fear against the chance at redemption. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, I'll help you. God help us both, but I'll help you. Just tell me what you need me to do." Sophia pulled out her phone and began taking photographs of the room, of the files, of the wall covered in victims' faces. "First, we document everything, every file, every piece of evidence. Then we need to secure these files before anyone else can destroy them. I'll contact the FBI in the morning and arrange for them to seize everything. And you're going to write down everything you know, every detail you can remember from the last 27 years, every crime you witnessed or heard about. It's going to be a long night, Uncle Thomas. But by the time the sun rises, the truth is going to be unstoppable. As she worked, photographing document after document, Sophia felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was grief for the grandfather she had loved, who had never really existed. There was anger at the man he actually was, and at the family members who had enabled him. There was fear about what was coming, the legal battles, the public scrutiny, the hatred she would face from her own family. But beneath it all was something stronger, a sense of purpose, of rightness, of finally doing something that mattered. She thought about all the families represented in these files, families who had spent years wondering what really happened to their loved ones, families who had been lied to and cheated and silenced. They deserved answers, they deserved justice, and she was going to give it to them no matter what it cost her. Hours later, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the stained glass windows of the library above, Sophia and Thomas emerged from the secret room, their arms full of files. They had documented everything, had secured the evidence, and had made the calls that would set everything in motion. By noon, FBI agents would be swarming the estate, seizing files and beginning their investigation. By evening, the story would be breaking on news channels across the country, and by the end of the week, the Harrington Empire would be in ruins, its fortune frozen, its reputation destroyed, and its crimes finally exposed to the light. Sophia stood in the library, looking at the hidden door one last time before the agents would arrive to seal it off as a crime scene. She thought about her grandfather, about the man who had built an empire on suffering, and had hidden the evidence of his crimes just steps away from where he had read her bedtime stories. She thought about her uncle, broken but finally free, finally able to stop carrying secrets that had nearly destroyed him. And she thought about herself, about the choice she had made, to be the one who ended the cycle of violence and lies, to be the one who valued justice over comfort, truth over legacy. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and it would cost her everything she had ever known. But as she looked at the photographs on her phone, at the faces of the victims who would finally get their day in court, she knew it was worth it. Some prices were worth paying, and some truths were worth telling, no matter how much they hurt. The Harrington name would become synonymous with corruption and crime, a cautionary tale about unchecked power and inherited guilt. But Sophia would carry a different legacy, the legacy of the woman who had the courage to destroy her own family's empire in the name of justice, who had chosen the hard right over the easy wrong, who had proven that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, was above the law. And in the end, that was a legacy worth inheriting. What would you have done if you discovered that your entire family fortune was built on decades of hidden crimes and covered-up murders? Would you protect the people you love, or would you sacrifice everything for justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like for more stories of crimes, secrets of powerful families, and investigations that no one dares to tell. Until the next case,